The day my family thought I was worth nothing. My name is Stephen Ward, and I was 57 years old when I learned what it feels like to have your own blood look at you as if you are worth nothing at all. I remember that morning so clearly it still plays in my mind like it happened yesterday. I walked into that cold, silent courtroom with my hands trembling just a little, and my heart beating heavy in my chest. The room smelled like old books and polished wood, and it felt like every sound echoed louder than normal. My cousins were already sitting in the front row, dressed in their sharp suits, pretending they were some kind of high rollers, when deep down everyone in town knew they had never earned a thing in their lives without grabbing it from somebody else. The moment they saw me step inside, they exchanged these sly looks, the kind that sting more than a slap. They had that same smug grin I had seen since childhood, the same look they wore whenever they thought they had gotten ahead of me. One of them leaned over to the other, whispering something that made both of them chuckle under their breath. They acted like they were watching a comedy show, and I was the joke. I took a seat behind them, trying to keep my breathing steady, trying to remind myself I belonged there just as much as they did, maybe even more. But still, the doubt sat heavy on my shoulders. For a split second, I wondered if they were right about me. I wondered if I was the forgotten nephew, the one no one expected anything from, the one everyone assumed would walk away empty-handed. The judge came in wearing his long robe with this tired, serious expression that told me he had seen far too many families tear themselves apart over money. He shuffled through the stack of papers in front of him, and his voice echoed across the room as he began reading out the inheritance totals. One cousin smirked, another bit down a laugh. I could hear their soft snickers every time a number was read, because they were so sure that when it came to me, the amount would be nothing. Zero. Not even a scrap. They wanted me to hear their laughter. They wanted me to feel that humiliation sink into my bones. And for a moment it worked. I felt a warm sting behind my eyes and a cold ache in my throat. I felt like the room was shrinking around me. I felt like that small, quiet kid again, the one they used to push aside while they took all the attention. I sat there wondering if maybe they had been right all along. Maybe I really was the outsider, the invisible one, the nephew who did not matter. But life has a funny way of turning the tables at the exact moment you feel beaten down. Because when the judge lifted his head and called out the next name, everything changed. He did not say one of their names. He did not read out another number for them to brag about later at the diner. He said my full name loud enough that even the cousins in the front row froze. Stephen Ward. The sound of it hit the room like a hammer. Their laughter stopped so suddenly you could almost feel the silence crack open. I felt my heart lurch in my chest as the judge kept speaking, and every word out of his mouth pulled me further away from the humiliation they had planned for me. That was the moment everything shifted. That was the moment they realized the man they spent their whole lives underestimating was not as small as they believed. And as the judge continued speaking, I felt something rise inside me, something I had not felt in years. Strength. Quiet, steady strength. The kind that comes from knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply being exactly who they never expected you to be. That was the day I learned that being underestimated is not a weakness at all. It is a hidden weapon, and that courtroom was the place where I finally understood what that meant. I grew up in a small rural town where if you sneezed on one side of the street, folks on the other side would bless you before you even pulled out a handkerchief. It was the kind of place where you could drive from one end to the other in under 10 minutes and still pass 5 people who knew your full name, your parents' names, and probably what you had for breakfast. Pride meant more than money. Respect meant more than titles. And reputation was something passed down like a family quilt. My cousins and I were raised on the same dusty roads under the same blazing sun, but somehow we lived in 2 completely different worlds. They were loud, messy, full of ego, and always convinced they were destined to be the kings of our tiny town. I was nothing like them. I was the quiet kid who kept to myself. I spent most afternoons sweeping the floors in my Uncle Ray's workshop, or handing him tools while he showed me how to fix old engines. Uncle Ray was the only one who looked at me and saw something more than the shy kid who kept his head down. He used to lean over his workbench squinting through those thick glasses of his and say, "Stephen, you got a mind that sees things others miss. Hold on to that." I did not always believe him back then, but the way he said it stuck to my bones. It felt like he could see a path for me that I could not yet see for myself. My cousins never liked that bond I had with him. They acted like I was just the tag along the spare, the extra piece nobody ordered. They teased me when I helped in the workshop. They called me the little apprentice. They said I was wasting my time while they were out trying to impress girls and pretending they were big shots at school. They wanted attention. I wanted purpose. And that difference followed us into adulthood like a shadow that never went away. When I turned 18, I enlisted in the service. Not because I wanted glory, but because I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to be useful. I spent years overseas traveling to places I had only read about in dusty textbooks. Every year I was gone, my cousins stayed right there in that same diner booth bragging louder and spending more than they earned. They bought fancy trucks on loans they could not afford. They strutted down Main Street like life owed them something. Folks humored them, but no one really respected them. Meanwhile, I worked hard, did my duty, and kept in touch with Uncle Ray whenever I could. He always asked when I would come home. I told him someday when the time was right. When I finally returned in my 40s, my hair a little grayer, my back a little tighter, I found a town that had changed just enough to feel unfamiliar. But Uncle Ray had not changed. He was older, of course, and slower, but his smile, when he saw me, was the same warm, calm smile he had given me since childhood. I started visiting him every Sunday without fail. Some days he talked for hours about the past. Some days he forgot what he had said 2 minutes earlier. Some days he just wanted to sit in silence while we drank tea. I did not care what kind of day it was. Being there felt right. Being there felt like returning to the only place where I ever felt fully understood. My cousins, on the other hand, barely visited him. They were always too busy chasing quick money. They were the kind of men who wanted to look important but never wanted to earn important. The town saw it. Uncle Ray saw it. But they never saw it in themselves. They were too wrapped up in the idea of being successful without ever doing the work that success requires. Then the day came when Uncle Ray passed at the age of 89. It felt like the whole town lost a cornerstone. Folks came by the house, bringing casseroles, offering condolences, telling stories about how he fixed their tractors for free or helped mend a fence after a storm. They remembered his kindness, his patience, his honesty. My cousins remembered something else. They remembered his money. Before we even buried him, the three of them were already arguing over who would get the land, who would get the workshop, who would get the savings account. They spoke like he was a prize, not a person. I could barely stand to listen. So I stayed silent and stayed out of their way because I refused to argue over anything that belonged to a man I loved and respected. I figured whatever the wolf said I would accept. If I got something good, if I got nothing, that was fine too. I did not expect much. I never asked for anything, but my cousins sure expected everything. They strutted around town telling anyone who would listen that the entire estate would go to them. They said I had no chance because I was just the quiet, broke uncle pleaser. They said I had wasted my life. They said the judge would hand me 0 and that I should not even show up to the reading. One of them even said something that burned into my memory. He said Stephen can stand in the hallway like the help while we divide up the real money. I heard them. Every word stuck under my skin like a thorn, but I did what I always did. I kept quiet, because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is patience waiting for the truth to finally speak. The morning of the inheritance reading arrived with a strange heaviness that seemed to settle over everything. The air, the house, even over my own heartbeat. I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun even considered rising, because sleep had become impossible. My mind kept circling the same thoughts over and over again, looping through memories of Uncle Ray, through memories of the way my cousins would laugh behind my back at family gatherings, through every moment I had felt small or lesser in their presence. It felt like my entire life had been gathering into this one day, like all the quiet humiliations and swallowed pride were standing beside me, watching, waiting. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long moment, letting the stillness soak into me, my hands pressed together like I was trying to keep them from trembling. Outside, the world was still and gray, wrapped in the chill that only early morning can carry. I stood up slowly and walked to my closet, pulling out the one coat that had ever made me feel like I belonged in a room full of people who judged by appearances. The old navy blue coat that Uncle Ray used to compliment every time I visited him. He'd always pat my shoulder and say, "Stephen, this coat makes you look like a man who knows his worth." At the time, I used to laugh it off, but that morning, as I slipped my arms into the sleeves and straightened the fabric carefully, those words clung to me with unexpected weight. I looked into the mirror, the faded edges of the glass reflecting a face that carried years of quiet endurance. My hair looked a little more gray, the lines on my forehead a little deeper, but there was something else in my eyes, a steadiness I couldn't fully explain. I whispered to myself, "Just breathe. Whatever happens, happens." It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was something close to it, something like acceptance mixed with defiance. The walk to the courthouse felt longer than it ever had. My steps echoed on the pavement, and every sound around me felt sharper, louder, as though the universe had turned up the volume on the world. When I finally saw the courthouse doors, tall and cold and made of heavy wood, a shiver went through me. I pushed them open and stepped inside, and instantly the smell of old paper, dust, and something almost metallic filled my lungs. It was the kind of smell that belonged to places where big decisions were made, places where people's lives changed with a few spoken words. And that's when I saw them, my cousins. They were scattered along the hallway near the entrance to the courtroom, leaning against the wall like they were posing for a magazine cover about successful heirs. They were dressed in their expensive suits, the kind that looked like they had been tailored specifically for smugness. They talked loudly, laughed loudly, and threw glances around to make sure people were watching. But the moment their eyes landed on me, their laughter sharpened. One of them, the loudest of the bunch, nudged his brother with an elbow and said just loud enough for me to hear, "Here comes Mr. $0." The others snorted and grinned, enjoying the cruel joke far more than they should have. A heat rose up my neck, flushing my cheeks, but I kept my breathing steady. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of reacting. I held my head up and walked right past them, refusing to let their pettiness drag me down before the day had even begun. Inside the courtroom, the air felt colder. The benches were long and wooden, polished so many times that they had become hard and shiny. I sat down slowly, my hands clasped together, my back straight, trying to ground myself. My cousins filed in behind me, filling the row directly across from mine like vultures waiting for a feast. A few of them glanced at me with raised eyebrows, some with outright amusement. I could sense their confidence, their certainty that today was just a formality, that everything would go exactly as they expected. The judge entered shortly after. He was tall, older, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested he had seen far too many family battles play out in this very room. He carried a thick stack of files, each paper inside carrying the weight of someone's last words. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a signal that everything was officially beginning. He started by reading the inheritance shares for each cousin. Their names were called one by one. Some received money, some received property, some received items from Uncle Ray's collection. And with every amount the judge listed, their faces brightened, their smiles grew wider. They elbowed each other like schoolboys, whispering jokes, glancing in my direction to see if I was crumbling yet. They wanted me to react. They wanted me to look defeated, hurt, humiliated. But I stared straight ahead, my gaze fixed on nothing and everything at the same time, refusing to give them any part of my dignity. Then something shifted. The judge paused, turning the page slowly, almost dramatically. He lifted his glasses, leaned closer to the document, and in a tone that carried more gravity than anything he had said before, announced, "Now regarding the primary beneficiary." Instantly, every cousin froze. You could feel the tension crawl across the room like electricity. From the corner of my eye, I saw heads turn toward me. They were waiting, anticipating. They expected the name to be one of theirs, or maybe the name of some distant associate, anyone but me. They wanted to hear that I was left with nothing, that I had been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten, just like they had always believed. But then the judge said my full name clearly, firmly, without hesitation. For the primary beneficiary, we have Stephen Ward. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. No one moved, no one breathed. My cousins stared at me like they had just watched the world tilt off its axis. One of them actually dropped the folder he was holding, the papers scattering at his feet. My heart thudded so hard against my rib cage I could feel the echo in my throat. The judge continued talking, but for several seconds his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if he were speaking from underwater. And then the words became clear again, words that would carve themselves into my memory forever. The house, the land, the savings, the workshop, and the trust fund all go to Stephen. The sound that followed was pure chaos. It was as if someone had shattered a mirror in slow motion. My cousins erupted with whispers, angry breaths, muttered curses. One cousin jumped to his feet, shouting something about unfairness, about favoritism, about mistakes. The judge slammed his gavel down and told him to sit or leave. He sat, but his face was twisted in rage. My hands shook. My vision blurred for a moment. I had not expected this, never, not even in my most hopeful dreams. I had walked into that courtroom ready to accept scraps or maybe even nothing at all. But this was something else. Something bigger, heavier, more meaningful than inheritance. It was validation. It was a revelation. It was a door opening after decades of feeling like every door had been shut in my face. And then came the final blow, the moment that would turn confusion into revelation. The judge picked up a small, sealed envelope, held it carefully between his fingers and said, "Uncle Ray left a personal letter with specific instructions to be read aloud only to Stephen." The explosion from my cousins was immediate. They argued, demanded answers, claimed they had a right to hear it. But the judge raised his hand and silenced them with a single firm gesture. I stood up slowly, feeling every pair of eyes in the room burn into me. I walked toward the front of the courtroom, my footsteps echoing through the silence. This was more than inheritance now. This was the moment where every year of being overlooked, mocked, dismissed, and underestimated came together to form a single truth. The judge opened the envelope. The paper inside crackled softly, almost reverently. And as he began reading Uncle Ray's words, the truth of everything, the reason, the story, the legacy, unfolded like a storm rolling in from the horizon, powerful, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. I stood there in front of the judge, the weight of the entire courtroom pressing down on my shoulders, making it feel as though my legs might buckle at any moment. The wooden floor beneath me felt uneven, or maybe it was just the trembling in my knees. My palms were damp, my throat tight, and for a moment I thought I might not be able to breathe at all. The silence in the room had grown so thick that it wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I could hear nothing, not the shuffle of papers, not the shifting of feet, not even the whispers of my cousins. It was as if the entire world had paused, the air holding itself still, waiting for the next words that were about to come. The judge carefully broke the seal on the envelope, his fingers slow and deliberate, almost respectful. He unfolded the letter with the same care, smoothing it out like it was something precious, something fragile, something that carried far more weight than the room understood. Then he lifted his eyes toward me briefly before lowering them to the paper again. His voice, when he began reading, was calm, steady, but each word landed like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples straight through my chest. Hearing Uncle Ray's words, his actual words, written in his own handwriting prepared long before this moment, hit me harder than I ever anticipated. As the judge read the first sentence, I felt something tighten in my throat, something I had been holding back for years. He wrote that he had spent years watching my life closely, even when I didn't know he was paying attention. He said he had seen every struggle, every sacrifice, every quiet decision I made when no one else was looking. He wrote that he knew how many times I had chosen responsibility over comfort, how many times I had stepped aside so others could have their way, how many times I had kept my dignity even when people tried to strip it away. He wrote that I never asked him for anything, not a loan, not a favor, not even a small blessing, despite all the rough times I had quietly endured. And in his words, I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt seen in my entire life. The judge continued reading, and I could feel each sentence sinking deeper into me. Uncle Ray wrote that true loyalty wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, wasn't something that needed to be performed. He wrote that loyalty lived in silence, in actions, in the things a man did when he thought no one noticed. He said that I had proven my worth not by speaking but by showing, not by asking but by giving, not by demanding but by standing firm through life's storms. His words felt like someone placing a warm hand on my shoulder, grounding me, reminding me that I was not invisible, not forgotten, not the nobody that my cousins always made me feel like. Then the judge's voice shifted slightly, becoming sharper, more pointed, as he read the part of the letter meant for the others, the part that was never intended to comfort. Uncle Ray wrote that my cousins had taken more from him than they ever gave. He said they only visited when they wanted something, only called when there was a benefit on the horizon, only pretended to care when they believed there was money involved. He said they saw his property not as a home but as a trophy, something to brag about, a symbol they could use to inflate their egos. He said he had watched them too, watched them treat him like a stepping stone, watched them treat his kindness like a bank account, watched them treat his health decline as an inconvenience rather than a loss. And the more the judge read, the more I felt the anger radiating from the benches behind me. My cousins stiffened, their faces hardening like concrete, their pride cracking under the weight of the truth being spoken aloud. Then came the final line, the one that would carve itself into every heart in the room. I leave my legacy to the only person who sat with me every week and treated me like a man, not a wallet, my nephew Stephen. The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder after a long silence. I felt them strike something deep inside me, something I hadn't dared to hope existed. For a moment, I couldn't swallow. I couldn't blink. I couldn't move. It felt like my entire life had been summarized in one sentence, one that held more truth than I could have explained even if given a lifetime. My cousins broke instantly, the composure they had worn like armor shattered. One of them slammed his fist against the bench so hard the sound ricocheted off the walls. Another cursed under his breath, the kind of bitter, poisonous word meant to injure. Another just sat there, shaking his head slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief, like he had just witnessed the ground collapse beneath him. They looked like men who had spent their whole lives building towers of pride only to watch those towers crumble in the span of a few sentences. They couldn't comprehend it. Their entire belief system, that loud mouths win, that flashy attitudes matter, that greed is a form of strength, was unraveling right in front of them. They had always thought that a quiet man like me was a shadow. They believed noise was power. They believed attention meant value. But now here was the truth, written in Uncle Ray's own hand, cutting through every lie they had told themselves. The judge folded the letter neatly, closed the envelope with the same respect he had opened it, and then extended it toward me. His voice softened as he said, "You may sit." The walk back to my bench felt heavier than the walk forward. Every step carried a new reality, a new responsibility. My cousins' eyes followed me like daggers stabbing into my back, blaming me, hatting me, seeing me as the thief of their dreams, even though I had stolen nothing. I could still feel their rage burning through the silence, their disbelief twisting into fury. I sat down slowly, my hands gripping the envelope as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. Inside me was a storm of emotions, relief that someone had finally seen me, fear of what would come next, disbelief that life had shifted so suddenly, and a quiet ache for all the years I had spent thinking I didn't matter. This wasn't the end of anything. This wasn't peace. This was the beginning of something bigger, something heavier, something that would change not just my life but every relationship in that room. And as I held that letter, feeling its weight, I understood that the real battle was only just beginning. The moment we stepped out of the courthouse, the cold air hit my face like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the heat burning in my cousin's eyes. I barely had time to take a breath before they rushed toward me, closing in so fast it felt like the walls of the building were stretching forward to trap me. Their footsteps were sharp against the pavement, their expressions twisted tight with rage, and their voices rose before I even reached the first step outside. It was as if the courthouse doors had opened straight into a storm. Mark, the oldest of them, moved in first. He had always been the loudest, the one who talked big but worked small, the one who thought being the one with the biggest voice made him the leader. He leaned in so close I could smell the bitter scent of his coffee-stained breath. His jaw was tight, his eyes wide with wild anger as he said, "You better hand over the workshop because you do not deserve it. Your name should have never been called. Give it up before things get worse." His words came out low and sharp, like he wanted to cut me with them. I stood my ground even though every instinct told me to step back. The courthouse was behind me, the parking lot in front, and these men who shared my blood but not my values surrounded me like a pack of wolves circling something they thought was weak. I kept my voice steady, not because I was calm but because I refused to let them hear the shaking inside me. I told him I did not take anything from anyone. The will spoke for itself. The law spoke for itself. Uncle Ray's words spoke louder than any threat they could make. My answer was like tossing gasoline on a fire. They erupted all at once, voices overlapping, angry spit flying, hands waving inches from my face. They yelled that I manipulated an old man. They yelled that I tricked him into signing everything over. They yelled that I was nothing but a washed-up 50-something man who wasted his life and now wanted to live off someone else's success. Each word was meant to sting, meant to bruise, meant to remind me of every insecurity I ever carried. And for a moment, it almost worked. I felt something in me tighten, something that had been tightening since childhood. But then I saw their faces twisted with greed, and I realized something important. They were not angry because they believed I fooled Uncle Ray. They were angry because they could not fool him themselves. I took a breath and forced my voice to stay firm. I said, "This is what he wanted. You can be angry, but you cannot change it." And the second those words left my mouth, I knew I had kicked the door wide open. Their expressions hardened even more. Their eyes narrowed, their fists clenched, but none of them dared lay a hand on me. Not out here in the open. Not with the courthouse behind us and people watching from across the street. They finally stormed off toward their trucks, walking fast, muttering under their breath, slamming doors hard enough to make the windows shake. I watched them drive off in a roar of engines and burning rubber. But even as the sound faded, I knew deep in my chest that this was far from over. People like them did not lose gracefully. They did not swallow pride. They did not accept truths that made them feel small. They carried grudges like weapons, and I knew they would not rest until they found a way to strike back. And I was right. It started barely a week later. I woke up early one morning the same way I always did. I made coffee, took a slow walk across the yard, and headed toward the workshop like I had done every day since I inherited it. The morning sun was soft, the air cool enough to wake me up fully. I reached for the workshop door and noticed it was cracked open. That stopped me cold. Uncle Ray had always locked it. I had locked it every night since the day the estate was settled. A feeling like a heavy stone rolled into my stomach. When I pushed the door open, I felt the grip of anger wrap around my chest. The workshop looked like a tornado had ripped through it. Tools were scattered across the floor like someone hurled them without care. Shelves were completely emptied and knocked sideways. Drawers were pulled out and dumped. Sawdust covered everything even though no wood had been cut since the week before. This wasn't robbery. Anyone could see that. Robbers take. Robbers look for valuables. Robbers search for something specific. But this devastation had a different energy to it. It was angry. It was personal. It was a message meant for me. I stood there for a long moment, my hands curling slowly into fists at my sides. My breath came out rough and heavy. This place mattered to me. This was where Uncle Ray taught me how to build things, how to repair things, how to be patient. This was the only place in the world that ever felt like mine. And these men, these cousins who never lifted a finger in that workshop, had stomped through it like it was trash. Then I saw it. One thing was missing, a small wooden box that had always sat near Uncle Ray's old toolbox. He had carved it himself decades ago. It held land documents, maps, receipts from years gone by, and some personal notes he had been writing over time. It was private. It was sentimental. It was supposed to stay with me, and now it was gone. I knew who had taken it. It was written all over the chaos. They wanted leverage. They wanted something they could twist. They wanted to find anything, even the smallest scrap, that they could use to run to a lawyer or to stir up trouble in town. They wanted to make me look like the thief, the liar, the manipulator they claimed I was. Standing there in the wreckage of everything Uncle Ray built, I felt something shift inside me, something that had been silent for 57 years. I had spent my life keeping quiet, stepping aside, letting others talk louder and push harder. But as I looked around that workshop, seeing the disrespect, seeing the cruelty, seeing the childish rage they had unleashed, something settled in my mind with a cold, steady certainty. That quiet man was gone. I was done being talked over. I was done being underestimated. I was done letting others decide my worth. And for the first time in my life, I felt something rising in me that was stronger than anger. It was determination, a promise forming deep in my bones that this time they would not break me. This time, they would learn exactly who they were underestimating. And that promise would become the spark that changed everything. And ugly left behind, whoever had smashed their way through my workshop. My hands were resting flat on the worn wood that had been polished smooth over decades of use. My breathing was still heavy from the anger gripping my chest. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the wreckage, hearing Uncle Ray's voice in my memory clear as day. He used to say, "A man who keeps calm in a storm wins the storm." I let that settle into me like warm sunlight breaking through a cold morning fog. Slowly my heartbeat steadied. My anger cooled just enough for me to think clearly. I knew better than to match fire with fire. My cousins wanted me to explode. They wanted me to lash out so they could paint me as unstable or ungrateful or greedy. They wanted a reason to drag me down with them, but I was not going to give them that. Fighting with fists or shouting would only turn me into the man they hoped I was. I was not going to fight with noise. I was going to fight with truth. Real truth. The kind that left no room for lies. I stood up and rolled my sleeves, the way Uncle Ray used to do before starting a big job. Then I began cleaning the workshop piece by piece. I picked up tools from the floor and set them gently back in place. I swept sawdust into a corner and scooped it into an old metal bin. I dusted shelves, fixed what could be fixed, and found a quiet rhythm in the process. Every tool I put back felt like reclaiming a piece of him and a piece of myself. The slow work calmed me and sharpened my focus. I was not helpless. I was not cornered. There was strength in knowing the truth was on my side. After working for a while, I noticed something strange near the far wall behind a wooden beam that had shifted slightly in the chaos. Something metal glinted in the dim light. I crouched down and reached for it. My fingers wrapped around a cold, old metal box covered in dust. I recognized it immediately. I had seen Uncle Ray tuck things in there years ago, but he never said what was inside. I wiped the dust away, gently pried it open, and saw a stack of letters and faded receipts tied together with an old piece of twine. Curiosity hit me fast. I carried the box to the workbench, sat down, and carefully untied the bundle. The first paper I unfolded made my eyebrows lift. It was a handwritten loan record from many years back. It showed one of my cousins borrowing money from Uncle Ray for a new truck. No repayment made. The next paper showed another cousin borrowing money for a business idea that never got off the ground. No repayment made. The next showed the third cousin borrowing for repairs on his property. No repayment made. The pattern repeated over and over. Debt, 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 all quietly taken from Uncle Ray and never returned. It hit me hard. While they had spent years calling me useless, calling me broke, calling me a worthless old man, they had actually been living on money they never earned. Money they had taken from the same uncle they pretended to love but treated like an endless bank. They walked around town bragging about their success, but these papers showed a different truth. They were takers, users. They had drained more from Uncle Ray than they ever gave back. Holding those papers, I felt something shift in my chest. This was not about revenge just for the sake of it. This was not me wanting to crush them because they mocked me. This was deeper. This was about clearing the name of the man who cared for me more than anyone. This was about dignity, respect, justice. I wanted to show the town the truth, not so the cousins would be humiliated, but so they would finally face what they had done. I wanted the community to know who had stood by Uncle Ray and who had drained him dry. A plan began forming in my mind, clear as a blueprint. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew I had to move carefully. With people like them, you do not charge forward blind. You prepare your steps. You line everything up. You stay patient. First, I gathered every document, every letter, every receipt, and placed them neatly in a folder. I took the folder to an old friend named Daniel who worked at the town council. Daniel was a straight shooter, the kind of man who respected honesty and held quiet loyalty close. We sat in a small office surrounded by filing cabinets and faded maps of county lines. He read through the records slowly, his eyebrows lifting more with every page. When he finished, he tapped the folder twice and said, "These are real. This is enough for a financial review. More than enough." Hearing that felt like the ground settling beneath my feet. The truth was not just emotional anymore. It was documented. It was official. It was powerful. Second, I returned to the workshop and poured my energy into restoring it. I tightened screws, rebuilt shelves, polished metal surfaces, and fixed the window that had been cracked during the break-in. The more I worked, the more it felt like the old place was breathing again. I could almost hear Uncle Ray humming while checking measurements. I could almost see him nodding at me with pride. My plan was to reopen the workshop as Ward Repair in honor of him. I wanted to keep his tradition alive, to serve the community the same way he always did. That workshop was not just a place for tools. It was a piece of our town's heart, and I wanted to restore it the right way. Third, I waited. Waiting requires patience, but sometimes patience is the sharpest tool you have. I knew my cousins were restless. I knew they were shaken by the reading of the will, and they were furious about losing everything they had counted on. I knew the break-in was not their final move. People like them did not stop after one strike. Their pride would not let them. And I was right. Within days, I noticed shadows lingering near my driveway at night. I noticed their trucks driving past my house slow and heavy even when they had no reason to be on my road. I heard rumors around town. Folks told me the cousins were filing complaints claiming I manipulated the will. I heard they were talking to lawyers, trying to pull something together. The lies were spreading like smoke from a fire that had not yet burned out. But this time I was not the quiet man they once walked over. I had truth. I had proof. I had a plan. And I could feel something in the air shifting, like the calm before a storm that would not break against me, but against the ones who created it. I knew that the battles coming were not going to be easy. But I also knew something else with a certainty as solid as the old workshop floor beneath my feet. This time the storm was mine to win. I should have known the quiet after my plan began to take shape was not peace at all, but the calm before the storm. Trouble from family never arrives with warning. It creeps in through familiar faces carrying familiar footsteps, and when the blow lands, it hurts twice as much because you know the ones who struck you used to share meals and childhood games with you. So the morning that the sheriff knocked on my door, wearing that heavy brown jacket and holding a clipboard under his arm, I already felt the weight of something wrong before he even opened his mouth. His expression said it all. He looked at me the way people look at someone who is about to step into fire. He shifted his hat to the back of his head and cleared his throat before telling me someone had filed an official complaint stating that I manipulated Uncle Ray's will, pressured him, controlled him, even tricked him during his final months. Those accusations cut me deeper than anything my cousins had ever yelled at me in the parking lot that day. I knew instantly who was behind it. They were the only ones whose pride was bruised enough to attempt something this reckless, something this cold-blooded. I went with the sheriff because I had nothing to hide. My heart was pounding the entire drive to the courthouse, but it wasn't fear. It was something heavier, something almost like grief. I was grieving the last remnants of hope that my cousins might realize how far they were falling. But greed blinds people. Entitlement eats their bones hollow. I walked into that courthouse feeling older than my 57 years, yet somehow stronger too, because something in me had settled. I had already seen their true faces, the break-in at the workshop, the stolen documents, the threats. This was just another chapter in the same story, but they walked into the building like royalty arriving at their palace, each cousin straightening their jackets and whispering to each other as if victory was already in their pockets. They were smirking so wide and proud it could make a stone crack from irritation. Mark even winked at me, as if this was some sort of game they were destined to win because they were louder, richer-looking, more confident. We gathered in a small review room instead of the main courtroom. The walls were pale and the air smelled like paper and old wood. My cousins sat together in a row, a wall of arrogance dressed in expensive fabrics. They spoke first. Their voices were full, dramatic, dripping with fake concern. They claimed that Uncle Ray wasn't in his right mind, that I influenced him, that I took advantage of his loneliness. They lied with the ease of people who had practiced their lines in front of mirrors. They stood there pretending to be responsible citizens, pretending to be loving nephews who only wanted fairness. Every sentence they spoke was a knife pointed toward my chest. But lies never age well, they rot fast. My lawyer, a quiet older man who had known Uncle Ray for decades, waited until they finished. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move much. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out the stack of documents I found in that hidden metal box, the receipts, the letters, the proof of every dollar they had borrowed and never paid. He placed them on the table in front of the judge, and the moment the papers hit the wood, the entire room shifted. The cousins' confidence evaporated so instantly it was almost visible. Their shoulders tightened, their faces drained, their eyes widened in disbelief, in fear, in the first taste of being exposed. The judge lifted the paper slowly, adjusting his glasses as he read through each page. His eyebrows pulled together, each line deepening with every new detail. Unpaid loans stretching over years, promises made and broken, excuses scribbled in their handwriting. When he finally looked up, the room felt colder than winter. He asked my cousins why they had borrowed so much and why there wasn't a single record of repayment. The words hung in the air like a hammer waiting to drop. They scrambled to answer, tripping over their own explanations. They blamed confusion, claimed forgetfulness, pointed at each other, anything but admitting the truth. Their voices cracked under the weight of their own guilt. Then came the question that sent them into full panic. Why were your footprints found inside Mr. Ward's workshop after the reported break-in? Their mouths opened but nothing came out, not one genuine word. The sheriff had already matched the prints, same boot tread, same mud patterns. They tried to deny it, but denial shrivels in the face of evidence. Every lie they attempted only dug their hole deeper. The judge watched them with a look that was part disappointment, part restrained frustration, the way adults look at children who think cleverness can cover wrongdoing. When the judge dismissed their entire claim, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth finally breathing after being strangled for too long. He not only shut down their accusations but issued a formal notice requiring them to repay damages for the break-in and the emotional and legal strain they caused. The judge's voice had a sternness to it that left no room for argument. I sat there listening, not smiling, not celebrating, just letting the moment sink in. Justice is not a joyful feeling. It is heavy, it is final. It carries the weight of everything that led to it. My cousins looked shattered. Mark's jaw twitched. One of the others stared blankly at the floor. Another kept muttering under his breath like his world had just crumbled. In that room, all their pride, all their loud confidence, all their greed burned up like dry leaves thrown into fire. They hunched their shoulders as if something sharp was pressing down on them from above. I didn't hate them in that moment. I didn't even feel triumphant. All I felt was tired. Tired from years of being overlooked. Tired from being treated like the quiet shadow of the family. Tired from carrying the burdens they created. But there was one thing I understood clearly as I walked out of the courthouse. This fight wasn't because I wanted something from them. It was because I refused to let them take something from me. Something Uncle Ray trusted me with. Something earned through years of loyalty, not bought with noise. And while that day ended with truth on my side, it also marked a turning point. Because the cousins' anger wasn't gone. It had only changed shape, and I could feel in my bones that their next move, whatever it was, would not be small. News in a small town moves like wind through dry grass, fast, restless, and impossible to stop once it starts. It doesn't matter if the walls of your home are made of brick or steel. When something dramatic happens, it will reach every corner, every porch, every diner booth, and every gossip circle before you've even finished your morning coffee. So when the judge dismissed my cousins' accusations and issued a notice that they had to repay damages, the story didn't just travel. It exploded across town. People who had never spoken a word to me before suddenly knew the whole tale. They remembered every time they'd seen my cousins showing off their trucks, their suits, their loud talk. And now they looked at those same cousins with narrowed eyes, the kind of eyes that say we thought you were something you're not. The same folks who had once praised them for being successful and hardworking began whispering behind their backs in grocery aisles and parking lots. It wasn't cruel whispering. It was disappointed whispering. Whispers that carried the sting of truth. While my cousin's reputation dimmed, something unexpected happened to mine. At first, people came by the workshop out of curiosity. Then they came with concern, and after that they came with kindness. One old neighbor brought a casserole baked in a dish older than I was. A teenager from down the road showed up with a toolbox saying he wanted to help fix the shelves that had been knocked over. An older man I barely knew brought me a set of new nails and screws, saying, "Ray always spoke well of you. You're doing right by him." And some people didn't bring anything except their presence. They just stood beside me in the workshop, offering quiet company, the kind that makes you feel grounded without a single word spoken. For the first time in a long time, I felt something warm stir inside me, something that had been missing for years. Belonging. Real belonging, not the forced kind that comes from blood ties, but the kind that grows from respect, from mutual understanding, from shared history. The workshop, once silent and wounded from the break-in, began to buzz with life again. The sound of hammers, the smell of sawdust, the laughter that echoed off the wooden beams, all of it made me feel like Uncle Ray was still there, leaning on his old stool with that knowing half-smile. But peace in my life has always come with a shadow, and that shadow, as always, was cast by my cousins. Their humiliation from the courthouse didn't soften them. It sharpened them. They didn't stop to reflect or apologize. No, they went for the only weapon cowards use: lies. They slithered online, posting on every local page, every community group, every whispering corner of the internet. They spread rumors like poison in a river. They said I forced Uncle Ray into the will. They said I manipulated him during his final months. They painted me as some greedy old man desperate for money, desperate for recognition, desperate for anything I could grab. The worst part wasn't what they said about me. I've lived long enough to know that people will always talk, and words are only wind if you don't let them sink in. No, the part that lit a fire in my chest was how their lies stained Uncle Ray's name. They made him sound weak, confused, easily tricked. They made him sound like a man who didn't know his own mind. And that I could not accept, not when I knew better. Not when I had sat with him every week, listening to him speak with the same sharpness he'd always had. Not when his last letters still carried the steady handwriting of a man who saw the world clearly. So I did something I normally would never do. I spoke up, loudly. Before the monthly community meeting, I set up my camera and recorded a video message. I wasn't a fancy speaker. I wasn't polished, but I was honest. I talked about Uncle Ray in the only way someone who truly knew him could. I talked about the afternoons we spent drinking coffee on his porch. I talked about the stories he told of working his land, building his workshop piece by piece, never asking anyone for anything he could do himself. I talked about the laughs we shared, the lessons he taught me, the respect he carried for every person he crossed paths with, even those who didn't return that respect. Then I held up his handwritten letters, the ones that proved beyond doubt that his mind was strong and his decisions were deliberate. I read his words slowly, letting each sentence breathe in the room. The people in that meeting hall sat silent, listening with the kind of stillness that only comes when truth is finally breaking through layers of lies. They heard Uncle Ray speaking through me. They heard his intentions. They heard his clarity. And when the video ended, the room erupted, not out of excitement, not out of drama, but out of understanding. The applause wasn't for me. It was for the truth, for justice, for Uncle Ray's memory. My cousins didn't stay for the end. I noticed them sliding out halfway through the clapping, their shoulders hunched, their faces tight. They walked fast like men trying to outrun shame. But in a small town, shame moves faster than feet. As I stood there surrounded by people who now saw the full picture, I felt something settle deep inside me. A sense of calm, a sense of confirmation. Not that I was right, but that Uncle Ray's faith in me had not been misplaced. The community finally saw the truth. The night of the final confrontation felt heavier than most. The moon hung low, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the workshop yard. I had just finished sweeping the floor, locking up the tool cabinets and turning off the lights when I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. It wasn't a familiar sound. It was too slow, too deliberate, too tense. I stepped outside and saw headlights cutting through the darkness, a truck rolling to a stop like a beast unwilling to rest. And then they stepped out. All three of my cousins. There was no swagger in their steps this time, no smug smiles, no loud barking laughter meant to show dominance. They looked different, tired, worn down, almost hollow. Their shoulders drooped as if they were carrying their own failures like sacks tied to their backs. For a moment, the silence between us stretched long and sharp. Even the night air seemed to hold its breath. Mark, the boldest of them, walked forward first. He didn't puff out his chest or tilt his chin the way he used to when he wanted to look bigger than he was. Instead, he shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and stared at me like a man who had lost every argument life ever threw at him. His voice was lower than usual when he said, "We want one last talk." I didn't move closer. I didn't invite them inside. I simply said, "Make it quick," because I had learned long ago that nothing good ever followed when those three showed up unannounced, especially after dark. For a second, none of them spoke. The night hummed with faraway crickets, and the cold air stung my lungs as I waited. Finally, Mark lifted his head, his face painted with bitterness. Not anger, bitterness. "You've ruined our lives," he said, putting weight behind every word as if he hoped guilt might spill out of me like water tipping from a cracked glass. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the need to explain myself or soften anything. I looked him in the eye and said slowly, "No, you ruined them by trying to steal what was never yours." The sentence didn't echo, but it hit hard, like truth always does when someone has spent their whole life running from it. Their expressions didn't explode with rage like before. Instead, they crumbled. It was subtle, but I saw it. The twitch of a lip, The tightening around the eyes, the way one cousin shifted his weight like he suddenly felt too exposed. They weren't there to threaten me anymore. They weren't trying to fight. They were trying, in their own twisted way, to rewrite the ending, to cast themselves as the victims in a story they had authored with their own greed. They wanted me to feel bad, to shoulder some of the burden they created. They wanted me to crack just once so they could say, "See, he feels guilty. That means he was wrong." But I didn't, and that silence, my silence, was louder than anything I could have yelled. I kept my voice steady, calm, grounded. You could have had a good life. You still can. You could have visited him. You could have cared. You could have acted like family. But you didn't. And now you're here blaming me because you don't want to admit what you did. They didn't argue because they couldn't. I watched realization move across their faces like a dark cloud. All their schemes, all their lies, all the noise. They hadn't gotten them a single thing. They stood on that gravel lot empty-handed while I stood inside the life Uncle Ray left me, the life I had earned through loyalty, through respect, through years of simply showing up. Mark finally muttered something, not quite an apology, not quite an accusation, just a tired exhale shaped into words, but I didn't need to hear it. The meaning was already in the air. They had nothing left to fight with. I took a slow step forward, not threateningly but deliberately. "Listen," I said, "I'm not here to destroy you. I never was. You made your choices. And if you want to rebuild your lives, you can. But if you come after me again, if you attack me or my name or Uncle Ray's memory, I promise you I'll defend myself every single time and I won't back down. Not now, not ever." They all looked down like children caught stealing from the cookie jar. Not a single one of them dared to look me in the eye after that. The night swallowed their pride whole. They turned around slowly, walked back to the truck, and shut the doors one by one with soft thuds that sounded eerily final. The engine started. The headlights cut through the darkness again, and as they drove away, their truck disappearing down the dirt road like a shadow retreating into the distance, I knew something with absolute certainty. That was the last time they would ever try anything against me. And for the first time in a long time, the workshop behind me felt like a fortress, not of wood and tools, but of truth, justice, and the legacy of a man who chose loyalty over blood. Months rolled by in a rhythm I hadn't expected to find at my age. The workshop, once battered and bruised from the chaos my cousins left behind, had found new life. The air inside smelled of polished wood, fresh paint, and the faint tang of metal heated from the soldering torch. Every corner felt alive again. I had rebuilt the shelves, organized every tool, and put the little wooden box that Uncle Ray had treasured back in its place, now safe and intact. People in town stopped by not only to have things repaired, but to share stories, to ask advice, to check in on the man who had kept his promise to Uncle Ray and stayed true to the legacy that mattered. The whispers that had once tried to tarnish me had faded. Instead, they spoke of respect and steadiness, and that felt heavier, more satisfying than any applause I had ever received. I began inviting local kids into the workshop. They were a curious bunch, wide-eyed and eager, some shy, some bold. I showed them how to sand wood properly, how to measure twice and cut once, how to fix a leaky hinge without forcing it to break. They laughed when mistakes were made, but I encouraged them to keep trying, to be patient, to respect the process as Uncle Ray had taught me. There was something pure about seeing them learn, about passing on knowledge that had been passed to me. It gave my life a rhythm, a purpose I hadn't known I'd been missing. I liked the peace of it, the routine, the quiet satisfaction of a job done right, the way the small victories stacked up day after day until they became something meaningful. And then one ordinary afternoon, while I was tightening a bench vise for a local farmer, the mail slot clanged, signaling the arrival of letters. Among the bills and catalogs was an envelope that made my heart skip. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Mark. My first thought was suspicion, a leftover instinct from the nights of break-ins, threats, and endless bitterness. But there was also a fragile hope hidden beneath the weight of years of family tension. I opened the envelope slowly, feeling the paper between my fingers as if it could somehow tell me the truth before I read a single word. The letter was shaky, the penmanship uneven, almost as if he had written and erased multiple times, struggling with the courage to put his thoughts on paper. And yet it was honest. In the words, he admitted the mistakes, the jealousy, the greed that had poisoned our family for decades. He apologized for the pain he had caused, not just to me, but to Uncle Ray's memory, to the community, and to himself. He wrote about the nights he had lain awake thinking about the injustice, realizing finally that the anger and bitterness had eaten him alive long before he ever thought about me or the inheritance. He said he was tired of living angry and asked, hesitantly, if we could start fresh, if we could find some way to move forward and rebuild what had been shattered between us. I read the letter more than once, letting every word settle deep inside me. For a long while I didn't respond. I thought about every insult, every stolen night of sleep, every broken plank of the workshop. I thought about all the years my cousins had laughed at me, at the man who they thought would end up with nothing. And then I thought about Uncle Ray, how he had always believed in the power of patience, in the strength that comes from doing right even when wrong surrounds you. Finally, I picked up my pen and wrote back. I told him what I had learned through all the battles, all the betrayals, all the nights when I had questioned my own worth. I told him that forgiveness is for the strong, not the weak, and that those who are brave enough to admit their faults and face their past deserve a chance to start over. I didn't promise that everything would be perfect. I didn't erase the past. But I offered him a chance to meet me halfway, to rebuild trust slowly, carefully, the same way one rebuilds a broken piece of furniture with care and respect. Sending that letter felt like the last plank being nailed in place, the last layer of dust swept from the workshop floor. For the first time in years, I felt whole, not because my cousins had changed overnight, but because I had. I had found the strength to close the chapter with dignity, to protect what mattered, to honor Uncle Ray in the way he would have wanted. That letter, simple as it was, became the closure I had longed for. A quiet ending to a storm that had raged for decades, leaving space for something better, something stronger, something true. The workshop continued to hum with life, with students learning, neighbors visiting, repairs being made. And in every plank, every nail, every stroke of the brush, I could feel Uncle Ray's presence. The past had left scars, yes, but the future, steady, calm, and built on truth, was mine to shape. Now, sitting in the workshop that has become more than just a place of repairs, more than a building of wood and nails, I often find myself staring out the open door at the late afternoon sun spilling across the gravel. The dust dances in the warm light, catching tiny fragments that glint like pieces of gold. And in those quiet moments, when the hum of life slows just enough to let the past settle, I think back to that courtroom moment, the one etched into my memory as sharply as the grain on the old workbench. I remember my cousins, laughter, their smug faces lined up like they were ready to celebrate my defeat before the judge even spoke my name. At the time, it felt like the world had decided I was nothing. It felt like the weight of every insult, every glance, every whispered word had been pressing down on my shoulders for decades. And yet, looking back now, I do not feel anger. Not in the way I used to. Not the burning, restless anger that keeps a man awake at night. Instead, I feel something far stronger, clarity. Being underestimated is not a curse, I've learned. In fact, it is a shield. When people see you as weak, when they believe you are small, they reveal themselves without knowing it. They let their pride, their greed, their envy spill out in ways that show the true measure of their character. My cousins thought their loud voices, their flashy trucks, their confident steps could outweigh years of quiet loyalty and patience. They miscalculated. They underestimated the strength of a man who had spent decades building not wealth or status, but integrity and honor. That moment in the courtroom, when the judge read my name and handed me everything, was not just a legal victory. It was proof that dignity, when held quietly and firmly, carries a power that no boastful claim can touch. I have learned that dignity wins slowly, but it wins strong. It does not announce itself with shouts or threats. It grows in the quiet hours, in the patient labor, in the choices you make when no one is watching. I have watched it work like a river carving stone, steady and unstoppable. I have learned that loyalty, real loyalty, is louder than any mouth, stronger than any lie, and more enduring than any fleeting claim to wealth or influence. Every Sunday spent with Uncle Ray, every tool repaired, every hour spent listening, those were the investments that mattered far more than money ever could. And in the end, when the world tried to tell me I was nothing, those choices became the proof of who I was. I've also learned that a man's value is never measured by inheritance alone. It is measured by the respect he earns, not the fortune he holds. It is measured in the lives he touches, in the lessons he passes on, in the legacy he builds through patience, honesty, and care. The money, the land, the workshop, all of it is secondary to the truth that I carried in my heart and in my actions. And that truth, unlike any fortune, cannot be stolen, cannot be denied, and cannot be taken away. Looking back, I see the full circle of this story. A quiet man in his late 50s, overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, standing in a courtroom surrounded by family who had long since forgotten the meaning of integrity. I see the fear in their eyes when the truth surfaced. I see the respect in the community when they finally understood who I had been all along. And I see the peace in myself, the knowledge that I had not just survived the storm, but had learned from it, grown from it, and emerged stronger for it. This is my story. A story of patience, of quiet strength, of unwavering loyalty, of justice delivered not through noise or anger, but through persistence and truth. A story of a man who everyone thought would walk away with nothing, who was laughed at, dismissed, and underestimated. But in the end, I walked away with something far greater than any inheritance. I walked away with truth, with justice, with a legacy rooted in the lessons Uncle Ray had taught me, and in the strength I discovered in myself. A legacy that no one can take, a story that no one can erase, and a life lived with dignity, respect, and clarity. And when I close my eyes at night, listening to the wind drift through the workshop and the faint creak of old wood settling, I smile quietly to myself, knowing that being underestimated was never my weakness. It was always my greatest advantage.